advent of Julius Caesar's adopted son Augustus as Imperator of Rome ushered in a golden age for Roman literature, art, science, and commerce. After more than a century of brutal civil wars, the success of Augustus in appearing to rule through the old republican constitution, while in reality wielding absolute power, restored political stability to the state. This new political situation, the latest in a long line of experiments in governance that we have considered, gave rise to a new era of optimism, the so-called Pax Romanum, in which the creative genius of the Romans was able to flourish. The question of how to define the essence of Roman cultural and technological creativity has divided historians for millennia. Some Western scholars have suggested that the cultural legacy that the Romans ultimately passed on to Western civilization was unoriginal because this legacy was essentially Greek in nature. A similar argument has been made by some Chinese historians about the relative unoriginality of Han Dynasty culture when compared to that of their predecessors, the Zhou. Some take this further by arguing that it was the preservation by the Romans of so many original Greek political, intellectual, and scientific ideas about the world that was the Romans' single greatest contribution to world history. Now, there is no doubt that the Romans were fascinated by Greek achievements in many fields. But like the evolution of culture throughout world history, what emerged from this fascination was not just a slavish copying of Greek ideas, but rather the creation of a new syncretic Greco-Roman culture that combined Greek traditions with Latin innovations. This trend towards cultural syncretism continued when, late in the Roman Empire, Greco-Roman culture was further infused with Christian and Germanic ideas. And it is this polyglot that essentially became the cornerstone of Western civilization. The emergence of a Greco-Roman syncretic culture became obvious during the Augustan Golden Age. We know, for example, that wealthy Romans had a passion for Greek sculpture, which was shipped wholesale from the Greek polis to the homes of Roman Elytz. But Roman sculptors almost immediately started modifying the idealized Greek model, adding more realistic portraiture and new decorative motifs. Once public sculpture began to be used as official propaganda to increase the status of Augustus and his successors, Roman artists were commissioned to create glorified representations of the imperial family. Augustus was himself portrayed in an astonishing variety of guises and attitudes, as kindly, innocent, or sympathetic in some busts, as leader of the city wearing the civic crown, as heroic military leader wearing armor in full-size statues of marble or bronze, as Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of the state, presiding over the religion of the Romans, as Egyptian pharaoh, and even as a god to be worshipped by his people. Put simply, the Romans took the practice of using art as propaganda to a level never imagined by the Greeks. We can discern similar developments in the field of literature. A fascination by early Republican Roman authors with Greek literature was followed by an Augustan period in which Roman poets and historians began creating their own unique masterpieces that proved every bit as influential on Western civilization as the earlier works of the Greeks. The Roman senator and orator Cicero, who lived from 106 to 43 BCE, rose from the ranks of the middle class to the position of undisputed master of the Greek sophistic craft of rhetoric. Instead of Greek, however, Cicero used Latin in his powerful speeches and essays, helping turn that language into something every bit as expressive and literary as Greek. During the Golden Age, many Roman writers followed Augustus's lead in celebrating the traditional values of Roman civilization: family, dignity, civic duty, even a renewed appreciation of the simple life of the countryside. Literature, art, and architecture were also given a tremendous boost in Augustan Rome through the benevolence of wealthy patrons like Augustus's friend Maecenas, who had the resources to commission talented Romans to create everything from poetry to magnificent new buildings. Understandably, given the prosperity this brought to artists, some of the material they produced was openly patriotic in nature, celebrating the triumphs of Rome and particularly its glorious leader, Augustus. In this environment, the writing of history was bound to be influenced by a sense of civic pride, which is seen particularly in the work of Livy, who wrote a sprawling history of Rome from its mythic beginnings through to his own glorious times. Livy was a marvelous storyteller, and his stirring accounts of Rome's early struggle for freedom against Etruscans, Greeks, Gauls, and Carthaginians has proven to be an ongoing inspiration for painters, poets, and politicians in the centuries that followed. Augustus himself was patron to the Italian poet Horace, providing the author with the time, resources, and leisure he needed to write. Horace was strongly influenced by Greek verse, but in his most famous work, the Odes, produced around 23 BCE, he combined Greek technique with superb lyrical Latin to praise simple Roman pleasures like love, wine, and the idyllic life of the countryside. Horace believed that both Rome and his own poetry would live forever. Even though the Roman Empire did eventually dissolve, his work has indeed endured, thus justifying Horace's claim that I will not entirely die, since my poetry will be a monument more lasting than bronze. We've already met the poet Virgil, whom some would argue was the greatest of all Roman poets, based on his masterpiece about the legendary founding of Rome, the Aeneid. Written between 30 and 19 BCE, and clearly inspired by the Homeric epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, the Aeneid follows the exploits of Aeneas, who, after having fought against the Greeks at Troy, searches for a place to establish an Italian homeland. Like an archetypal Roman, Aeneas sacrifices the love of Dido, the beautiful queen of Carthage, in the name of duty and conquest. Virgil had not completed his poem of Roman destiny when he died in 19 BCE. It was Augustus himself who personally overruled the poet's dying request that the manuscript be burned, fortunately for us. As well as being a period of lofty artistic ideals, the Augustan age was a cosmopolitan era that celebrated sensual pleasure, which meant that not all Augustan poets were focused on such grand or serious themes. Sextus Propertius, for example, was uninterested in war or politics. He preferred to write about love and sexual passion, as did his contemporary, the sophisticated and disdainful poet Ovid. Ovid's work, the Ars Amatoria, the art of love, was in essence a handbook of sex and seduction for both men and women. Ovid's one big mistake was to get involved in some mysterious scandal which may have involved the emperor's daughter Julia. Because of this, he was banished to a small Roman outpost on the Black Sea where he lived in apparent misery. There he wrote poetry and letters dedicated to Augustus, begging forgiveness so that he could return to Rome. But Augustus never forgave Ovid, who died in exile. Augustus himself died peacefully in 14 CE, and the period following his reign posed serious challenges for Roman intellectuals. Augustus's Julio-Claudian family provided a series of successes for the next half-century, and what a mixed lot these emperors were. Let me offer you a brief summary of their reigns. Two of Augustus's successors, the sadistic Tiberius and the hunchback Claudius, were actually quite able administrators. But Caligula was a madman who thought he was a god and insisted that his horse be made a senator, and Nero murdered his own wife and mother and persecuted Jews and Christians. Then he famously fiddled while Rome burned, or rather played his lyre to accompany his own singing while he watched the flames devour much of the city from the balcony of his palace on the Palatine Hill. The authors and poets who lived through this later Julio-Claudian era, a period sometimes referred to as the Silver Age of Latin literature, were only too aware of the foibles of their rulers and also the dangers of openly mentioning these in their works. One author who ran afoul of the emperor was the philosopher and essayist Seneca, who was also employed as Nero's tutor. When Nero suspected Seneca of involvement in a conspiracy, he forced the philosopher to commit suicide. Another gifted author who wrote during the reign of Nero was Petronius Arbiter, who has left us an extraordinary novel called the Satyricon. It contains flesh and blood portraits of many vulgar individuals who lived lives of astonishing excess. Petronius too was accused of conspiracy against Nero and killed himself rather than wait for the inevitable death sentence. 69 CE was a year of chaos in Rome. 4 emperors contested the throne, but order was restored by the hard-nosed soldier Vespasian and his sons, who ruled as the Flavian dynasty for the next 30 years. They were effective but autocratic rulers who stabilized Roman government after the extremes of the Julio-Claudians. This brings us to a period of 84 years between 96 and 180 of the Common Era, when a group of 5 Antonine emperors built on the work of the Flavians to provide generally excellent leadership. Under the Antonines, Rome reached the height of its prosperity and power, an apogee celebrated 1,500 years later by the English historian Edward Gibbon, who in his epic Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire lauded the Antonine age as a happy period of more than 80 years, during which the public administration was conducted by the virtue and abilities of Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, and the 2 Antonines. Let me offer you a brief portrait of 3 of Gibbon's virtuous and able rulers: Trajan, Hadrian, and Marcus Aurelius Antoninus. Trajan was born in 53 in the city of Italica in Spain. He was a superb soldier and rose quickly through the ranks of the Roman army, serving on some of the most contentious of the empire's frontiers, notably against the Germanic tribes. By the time the Emperor Domitian was killed in 96 CE, Trajan was recognized as one of the foremost military commanders of the empire, and this reputation served him well under Domitian's successor Nerva, who was unpopular with the army and needed to do something to gain their support. He accomplished this by naming Trajan as his adoptive son, a practice of Roman emperors that served as a way of anointing their successors. It was the future Emperor Hadrian, Trajan's eventual successor, who brought word to Trajan of his adoption, which meant he had Trajan's favor for the rest of his life. When Nerva died in January 98, Trajan succeeded him without incident, becoming the first non-Italian Roman emperor. Trajan's reign was distinguished by the expansion of the empire to its greatest extent, but his successor Hadrian realized that some of these new provinces were indefensible. When he came to power, he stabilized the empire by restoring some of these regions to autonomous rule, and also erected key defensive walls in Germany and Britain. Perhaps you have walked like me along parts of Hadrian's Wall in the north of England. Hadrian also founded new cities to try and keep out the Germanic tribes who, during his reign, seemed to be clamoring more and more at the very gates of the empire. The third of this trio of able administrators was Marcus Aurelius, who reigned for 20 years until 180 CE. Marcus was forced to spend much of his reign as a soldier fighting on the front lines, also trying to push back the Germanic tribes. But in his spare time, he wrote superb Stoic philosophy that even Epictetus would have been proud of, collected and published as the Meditations. Marcus Aurelius was the last of Gibbon's 5 good emperors. As we visualize the empire at the end of his reign, we see a huge imperial state that stretched from Scotland to Iraq, home to 100 million people, connected to the rest of Eurasia by trans-regional trade, and with the extraordinary megalopolis of Rome at its heart, a sprawling combination of magnificence and squalor. The stability and prosperity of the Antonine age produced many superb writers, like the witty biographer of the great and powerful Suetonius. As imperial librarian during the reign of Hadrian, Suetonius had unparalleled access to official records and used these to provide an intimate portrait of his age in Lives of the Caesars. Other writers grew cynical about the role of spectacular public entertainment in the Roman Empire. The Roman calendar contained about 100 holidays a year on which some sort of public entertainment was provided by the wealthy elite and by ambitious politicians. On any given day, this entertainment might be in the form of chariot races in the Circus Maximus, a vast stadium holding up to 150,000 spectators, or gladiatorial games in the gigantic venue of the Colosseum, where armed men fought ferocious animals or each other in vicious combat. There was always plenty of variety at the Colosseum: animal hunts, African wildcats fighting each other, men fighting bears, or gladiators fighting gladiators in one-on-one combat that cost the lives of roughly 50% of the fighters each show. The philosopher Seneca bitterly noted that for a gladiator, the only exit is death, although some gladiators managed to survive long enough to become superstars in the city. Rome's extraordinary entertainment venues were regarded as cathartic and when combined with free bread that the governments regularly doled out to the people as a way of keeping the commoners of Rome content. Of course, the astute literary observers of Roman life understood exactly what was going on. The satirist Juvenal famously wrote, "Long ago the people shed their anxieties. Ever since we do not sell our votes to anyone. For the people who once conferred imperium, symbols of office, legions, everything, now hold themselves in check and anxiously desire only two things, the grain dole and chariot races in the circus." How accurately Juvenal's famous phrase, panem et circenses, bread and circuses, captures the trade-off humans often make between political rights and distracting entertainment. Imagine how the history of the world might have turned out differently if Elytz had not proven so good at diverting the energies of the populace as a way of heading off political unrest. Appalling as the violent spectacles of Rome are to modern sensibilities, the venues in which they took place remain marvels of engineering construction. The gigantic stadiums of the Circus Maximus and the Colosseum are some of Rome's most famous buildings, but Rome's superb engineers built impressive monumental structures all over the empire: aqueducts, temples, bridges, and a magnificent road network. The speed of travel on the 50,000 miles of constructed roadways the Romans built was not surpassed until the 19th century. Roman engineers were also amazingly methodical in their construction of bridges and aqueducts, like the iconic Pont du Gard in southern France, which all incorporated the stone arch in their design, so solid that tiers of arches could be placed one on top of another. The arch allowed the Romans to build bridges and aqueducts with very long spans, and also to lay their road network across the landscape with little regard for the course of rivers. In the capital, aqueducts were able to supply up to 50 gallons per day for each of the 1 million citizens of Rome during the Antonine Age. Another important Roman construction innovation was the invention of concrete, which made it possible to pour formworks to create walls, vaults, and domes. Even today, when builders use forms of timber to contain poured concrete, they are essentially emulating the original Roman technique. Dried concrete is very strong, of course, which means once set, it could be used to make huge vaulted domes that did not need supports. The classic example of this is the gigantic Pantheon in Rome, which has a diameter of 43.3 meters, much larger than the domes of St. Peter's in Rome or St. Paul's in London, even though these structures were built many centuries later. Engineering of this quality was based on a superb grasp of mathematics, and as we consider these sophisticated advances, we must inevitably return to the original question of Greek influence on Roman culture. We have seen previously the scientific advances that occurred in the Egyptian city of Alexandria during the Hellenistic age. Those advances barely slowed when Alexandria became part of the Roman world, and they weren't applied only to architecture. They also were essential in what were some of the earliest attempts to measure the planet and the solar system. Back in the 3rd century before the Common Era, the Greek scientist Eratosthenes had calculated a number for the circumference of the Earth that was very close to its actual circumference, roughly 40,000 kilometers. Eratosthenes came up with this figure by measuring the angle of sunbeams in both Alexandria and modern Aswan, then correlating the difference in the angles with the distance between the two locations. Another Alexandrian scientist working in the 3rd century, Aristarchus, used the apparent sizes of the Earth, Moon, and the Sun and their positions with respect to one another to determine the relative distances between those bodies. Aristarchus and other astronomers were also coming to consensus at this time that, to quote Archimedes, the diameter of the Earth is greater than the diameter of the Moon, and the diameter of the Sun is greater than the diameter of the Earth. But it was the work 4 centuries later of Claudius Ptolemy, who worked in Roman-controlled Alexandria during the 2nd century of the Common Era, that was destined to have the longest influence on astronomy. Ptolemy thought that the Earth was shaped like a sphere and was located at the center of the universe, which was composed of many other spheres that orbited around the Earth including the planets and stars. Planets have two distinct types of movements, Ptolemy argued: a circular movement around the Earth and a circular movement around a point lying on the circular orbit around the Earth. This ingenious epicycle theory proved remarkably good at allowing astronomers to predict planetary movements. So good, in fact, that the Ptolemaic model held up for the next 1,300 years. It only began to unravel when Polish mathematician Nicholas Copernicus, in a work published just before his death in 1543, was able to demonstrate that the Earth actually orbited the Sun. But Ptolemy aside, it is fair to point out that few other scientific breakthroughs on this scale occurred during the Roman period. Rather, what we see are attempts by Roman authors to summarize Greek scientific discoveries, such as the poetical work by the Roman author Lucretius, which presented the views of the Greek atomists in condensed form. Especially noteworthy in this genre is the work of Pliny the Elder, who died during the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 CE. Pliny created a comprehensive multi-volume encyclopedia of natural history, the Historia Naturalis. This reference tool, much like modern encyclopedias or even like Wikipedia, provided a summary of all the knowledge of cosmology, geography, anthropology, zoology, botany, etc., that scholars before him had been able to assemble. Interestingly, one of the most enduring historical developments that occurred during the time of the Roman Empire grew not out of the prosperity and relative peace that Romans enjoyed, but out of Rome's turbulent relations with its religious minorities. During the reign of the Julio-Claudian emperors, some sects of Judaism began to develop new beliefs as part of the endless search for spiritual meaning that all human societies have pursued since the Paleolithic. Groups like the Essenes worked in secret on a radical new form of Judaism that scholars now recognize as the precursor to Christianity. The famous Dead Sea Scrolls were written by the Essenes. Judea was now part of the Roman Empire, and the Jews were far from happy. Some hoped for a Messiah to rid them of the Romans. Others took direct action, as in the uprising of 66 CE, which was ruthlessly crushed by the Romans and resulted in the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem. According to the New Testament of the Christian Bible, an infant named Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea in the time of Caesar Augustus and grew up to become a carpenter. Later, he began to travel all over Judea, preaching a message of love and, according to the Bible, practicing miracles. Word spread about Jesus, and when he reached Jerusalem for the Jewish feast of Passover, he was greeted by huge crowds, hoping that he was the Messiah who would lead a revolt against the Romans. The crowds ultimately turned against him, however, and he was charged with treason by Roman procurator Pontius Pilate and crucified. After his death, word spread that Jesus had been seen alive, and small communities of Christians began to appear. Christos is Greek for Messiah, so the term Christian referred to those who were followers of the Messiah. But Jesus' message of love and compassion might have disappeared like so many other radical ideologies had it not been for the work of Paul of Tarsus, an educated Hellenic Jew who had an epiphany and converted to Christianity. Paul spent the rest of his life traveling an estimated 8,000 miles on the superb roads and sea lanes of the Roman world, arguing that Jesus was actually the Son of God and he had died to atone for the sins of humanity. Paul was executed in Rome in 65 CE, but because of his extensive and active proselytizing, large numbers of Christian communities emerged across the Eastern Mediterranean. Like all the great world religions, Christianity was a faith that offered something permanent and optimistic to believe in, and it was egalitarian in that it maintained that every soul was equally important. But Christianity also offered a sense of community based on concern for the welfare of its members, something that the Roman state was increasingly unable to offer in its later stages. Most of all, Christianity held out the hope of something that none of the other religions of the Roman world offered: the possibility of eternal existence in an afterlife. For the Roman state, the exclusive nature of Christianity made it a subversive sect and many Christians were persecuted during the first 2 centuries of the Common Era, often scapegoated during times of political turmoil. By the early 3rd century, turmoil did indeed prevail throughout the empire. The economy was in crisis, and something like 26 despotic rulers reigned in just 50 years, most of them dying violent deaths. The able Emperor Diocletian restored some semblance of order late in the 3rd century, dividing what had become an ungovernable empire into eastern and western halves, each with its own leadership. Then civil war erupted, and Constantine fought his way to power. Constantine claimed to have had a vision the night before the crucial Battle of the Milvian Bridge, in which he saw himself raising a cross as his symbol. His success in the battle encouraged him to decree in the year 313 of the Common Era that Christianity would henceforth be tolerated throughout the empire. 12 years later, in 325, he invited all of the leading Christian thinkers to assemble at the Council of Nicaea, which resolved critical disputes over Christian beliefs. In 330, Constantine made the old Greek city of Byzantium the capital of the Eastern Empire, and it was later renamed Constantinople. But the endgame of Roman civilization, at least in its classic form, was fast approaching. Various German tribes had been increasingly drawn into the power vacuum created by the crisis of the 3rd century. The Roman army recruited many Germans into its ranks and allowed others to cross the borders and settle on Roman land, although many of these communities were mistreated by corrupt Roman officials. German restlessness was exacerbated by the arrival of the militarized Huns from Central Asia, yet another reminder of the crucial role pastoral nomads have played in the story of civilization. As a result of Hunnish incursions, one Germanic tribal confederation, the Visigoths, attacked and defeated the Romans at the Battle of Adrianople in 378. The Romans managed to hold the German tide back for a few more years, but finally, under Alaric, they invaded Italy, and Rome was sacked in the year 410. Germans now settled all over Western Europe, the Visigoths in Spain, the Burgundians in the Rhone Valley, the Franks widely across Gaul, and the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes in Britain. The Huns, meanwhile, led by the charismatic Attila, were finally defeated by a combined Roman and Visigoth army near Troy, and their confederation completely disintegrated after Attila died of a hemorrhage in 453 on the night of his marriage to a German princess. It was German officers of the Roman army who now held real power in the Western Roman Empire. And by 475, the Roman emperor himself was a German. For Edward Gibbon, this more or less marked the end of the Romans, and he chose the date of 476 to mark the so-called fall of the Roman Empire, a date that stood until quite recently when historians began to reevaluate the very concept of neat and tidy endings in history. Today, it's generally accepted that the new form of constitutional monarchy instituted by Caesar Augustus, that is Octavian, was maintained to varying degrees of effectiveness by a series of emperors through to the death of Marcus Aurelius in 180 CE. Thereafter, however, the imperial structure gradually